Good evening, everybody. My name is Christine Wallach, and I'm a trustee of the American Academy. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's lecture on curating concerts, classical music between Mozart and Mahler, given by our Anna Maria Kellen Berlin Prize Fellow Christopher Gibbs. Tonight's Anna Maria Kellen lecture is made possible through the long-standing generosity of the Kellen-Arnhold family, who provided the American Academy with its founding gift, and to whom we're grateful for their continuing support. We're here tonight in the former family villa, and it was also here that the late Anna Maria Kellen was born. I'd also like to thank Bernd and Brigitte Hellthaler for supporting this evening. We're so glad that you are able to be here in the audience tonight. And finally, before introducing Christopher, a remark about the difficult times we're living in. And as we're here tonight with so many musicians and performers and others watching from outside online, I'd like to give recognition to the support that musicians everywhere, especially in Germany and especially in Berlin, are giving via fundraising concerts and performances to help Ukraine. It's God's work, and I thank you for it. I think we all thank you for it. Most of you who are here tonight are Christopher's friends or professional colleagues and need no introduction to his career and vast accomplishments. But allow me nonetheless to say a few words about him to our Zoom audience. Since 2002, Christopher has been the James H. Otway Jr. Professor of Music at Bard College, where he also serves as co-artistic director of the Bard Music Festival. Before joining the Bard faculty, he taught at Columbia University, at Haverford College, and at the State University at Buffalo. Christopher's research interests are wide-ranging, including opera, music history, and in particular, the composers Mozart, Beethoven, Mahler, and Schubert. His publications reflect this scholarly range. He's the executive editor of Musical Quarterly, the oldest musical history journal in America, and co-author of the college edition of the Oxford History of Western Music. He's world-renowned Schubert expert, having edited the Cambridge Companion to Schubert, authored a Life of Schubert, now translated into 5 languages, and he's also co-edited Princeton University Press's Franz Schubert and His World. Christopher writes for scholarly as well as general interest publications, including 19th Century Music, Current Musicology, the Opera Quarterly, the Journal of the Arnold Schoenberg Institute, and many others. Beyond scholarship alone, Christopher is particularly devoted to public musicology, engaging the non-specialist audience in the appreciation of music, and to reaching audiences outside the Academy with his ideas and his knowledge. He's worked with many leading institutions, giving pre-concert lectures and writing program notes to bring musical scholarship to a broad, non-specialist audience, including the Schubertiade in New York at Carnegie Hall and at Lincoln Center, the Cleveland Orchestra, the New York and Los Angeles Philharmonics, among others. And for the past 22 seasons, he's been the program annotator and consulting musicologist for the Philadelphia Orchestra. Here in Berlin, just days after his arrival, he filmed a post-concert discussion with Thomas Hampson for this year's wonderful Schubert Week at the Pierre Boulez Saal. Christopher is in Berlin not just to continue his research, but also to explore its musical life, its rich history, and how music and musicians have persevered during the pandemic, and how they're thinking about the future online and in concert. Before handing over to Christopher for his lecture, let me just say a few words about how this evening will run. Christopher will talk for about 40 minutes, after which we'll have Q&A. If you're with us here in the room at the Academy, please raise your hand if you have a question. And if you're joining us via Zoom, please don't raise your hand, but instead type your question into the Q&A section on the Zoom platform. We'll see the submitted questions as they come up, and we'll do our best to answer them, relay them to Christopher and answer them. And apologies, of course, in advance if we're not able to get to all of your questions. So with that brief introduction, over you to Christopher, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you all for coming. It is such an enormous pleasure and honor to be a fellow at the Academy this semester. I'm enormously grateful in particular to all the people involved, my fellow fellows, that most of them are here tonight, the staff, the people that generously support the important mission of the American Academy, and the word I find myself, despite the realities of pandemic and war at this moment of being here is it's really paradise. And to be able to explore the particularly rich cultural and musical life of Berlin, I'm just a poor New York City kid, is just been overwhelming. And to see how it's been reacting to the pandemic as well as to political situations is enormously impressive. So, as often happens when one's asked for the title of a lecture long before one knows what one's going to talk about, I went for something that was pretty generic, a little bit alliterative, and that at least points to some of what I do want to do, my interest in the programming of festivals and of concerts, an attraction to the word curate that I'll be talking about, but then also pointing to these specific composers and the long 19th century, as it's sometimes called, from the French Revolution to the First World War, thus politics entering even in that time frame, to which I'll return at the end. So let me give you an overview of what I will go about doing. I think it'll be a little bit longer than 40 minutes because there will be some music interspersed with this, fortunately, along the way. I am going to use these bookends of Mozart and Mahler to begin at either end of the long 19th century, and then focus more on my area of real scholarly research, which has been Vienna in the first 3 decades of the 19th century around Schubert and Beethoven. I'll show a few concerts that really I think are representative and raise certain issues around concert life at the time, of sort of two, they weren't the debut concerts of these two figures, but the sort of crucial early concerts in their career, thus around 1800 and 1820, and also concerts of what maybe are their most famous pieces, the Fifth Symphony and the Lied Erlkönig. And then I will focus even more on a case study on a specific concert that Schubert gave that was probably the most important of his career and devoted entirely to his music on the 26th of March, 1828. And that is an important date because it was the exact first anniversary of Beethoven's death. So oftentimes I say this knowing that it's the Ides of March, dates matter, and it's important to be aware of them. So my interest in curating concerts has really wonderfully interacted with my graduate school experience and then career ever since, both as an academic and teacher and as a writer, but also as somebody who's been involved with the programming and presentation of festivals and concerts. And beginning in graduate school, I got involved with the Schubertiad at the 92nd Street Y, which was a crazy undertaking, spearheaded by the great German baritone Hermann Prey, to perform all of Schubert's music in roughly chronological order over 10 years and about 100 concerts. They got up to year 3. Schubert was 18 at the time, and this just was not viable. But it continued on a thematic basis that I'll talk about, and I directed the last 3 years of that festival. For the past 25 years, I've been most involved, and now I'm the co-artistic director with Leon Botstein of the Bard Music Festival, that each summer focuses on the world of a particular composer. His or her friends and enemies, teachers and students, obscure figures around the composer in 2 weekends of intensive concerts. So I'll reference that a little bit as well. My interest in curation, therefore, is of how concerts can be presented to a public that is eager for more than just the wonderful notes and great performers of great music. And the word curation and the etymology of cura, to care for something, is, I think, helpful in this regard. We're perhaps most used to it in connection with museum life, and I think that is a good reference point. For one reason being that when we go to an exhibition, we're interested in the juxtaposition of various images. We don't expect everything to be the Mona Lisa, but the sort of dialogue amongst images can be helpful. The gallery talks, the symposia around it, a wonderful catalog, one hopes, that gives more information. And this is something that a general engaged, intelligent audience is very eager for. With music, it is often somewhat more mystified that these magical performers and genius composers write the music, and we maybe listen to it too much in a vacuum, not connecting it with history and with life and politics of the time. And so what we found, and Leon Botstein's really been a pioneer in this type of thematic programming and making these sorts of connections, is that it is a very helpful way of engaging audiences. And I know some of the people in this room do this here and have done it through their careers, which is very inspiring to learn more about. And I've been very impressed with what I've been seeing here. So this idea of curation, I think, is something that helps of presenting to audiences, but something that I've enormously benefited in the process of doing this, of sort of making discoveries that help my scholarly work. And I think you'll see some of that. I would be asking somewhat different questions and coming up with different answers. So let me start with Mozart. The play and the movie notwithstanding, Amadeus was rarely used by him. The birth certificate is Theophilus, sometimes Gottlieb, most often Amadeus, spelled the accent this way. So I'm going to begin with Mozart, and I'm going to be showing you lots of programs. This one being a concert he gave at the Gewandhaus in Leipzig in 1789, May, 1 week after the break out of the French Revolution. This was a 2-month journey that he made from Vienna, 2 years before his death, to Prague, Dresden, Leipzig, Berlin, Potsdam, circled around and was away from Vienna for 2 months. And as you see, the program here is of which few survive for Mozart concerts, so it's just a rarity that we have this, is not very helpful. It tells you that it began with a symphony, and then there was a scene, a vocal scene, then a piano concerto, a symphony, the second half a piano concerto, more vocal music, solo piano fantasy, and ends with the symphony. In these cases, which is quite frequently the case, unless there's letters or diaries that are rather specific, sometimes reviews, but even music journalism was not so extensive at the time, we really don't know what the actual pieces were. Probably, as Mozart's practice would have been, even it's not 3 symphonies, but the symphony would be divided of opening and closing the first half of the concert, and then a complete symphony ending the entire program. Sometimes Mozart spread out the symphony over the concert. The first movement would open sort of as an overture, and then there'd be vocal music and piano music, and then the second movement would go back and forth. Not uncommon at all. So this is I've put in perhaps what some scholars think is most likely the 2 piano concertos he would have been playing at that time, but it's pretty much all speculative. Maybe a little bit more for the 2 vocal numbers. That was for Józefa Duček, a prominent Czech singer at the time for whom Mozart wrote these pieces, and Beethoven wrote for as well. So this gives you some idea of actually how frustrating it is of not having much information, let alone many programs at all, for reconstructing what concert life was like at the time. It's rather the opposite with Gustav Mahler, about which we know almost too much. The longest biography ever written of a composer, Henri Louis Goulart-Grange's 4-volume, over 4,000-page magisterial work, goes into excruciating detail on pretty much every concert, giving you the complete reviews of everything. There's a wonderful Mahler Foundation website that gives the programs of almost every performance he gave over his 50 years and every opera he conducted. And it's just, it's a wonderful resource to look at. And I've always been fascinated by this. And again, sometimes what it can tell us and reveal about Mahler and his career. So here's one interesting concert that he gave in the Concertgebouw in 1904. And even if Dutch is Greek to most of us, you'll see that he gave the first performance there of his 4th Symphony, followed after an intermission by a performance of his 4th Symphony. So this idea of performing a work twice on the same program, it still happens sometimes, particularly with new music. Beethoven's late Quartet, Opus 127, happened at the premiere that way. The great conductor Hans von Bülow famously in 1880 performed Beethoven's 9th Symphony twice on the same concert in Meiningen. Some people commented that it was a bit much, and there are other instances of that. What's maybe more relevant to a certain extent is how frequently movements and parts of pieces would be repeated at the time. We know this from Mozart letters, where he would say that a particular piece the audience really liked and that they loved the opening. How do you know that they loved the opening? Well, they were clapping during the music to indicate that it was a great way to start a symphony. And then he would say the concert couldn't go on until I had played it 2 more times. So this was actually rather frequent of immediate encores of a piece or of part of a piece. As many of you know, the charge against Mahler, who was recognized as a supreme conductor in his time, but many people resisting his music, was that his music was banal, inappropriately mixed high and low styles, and that it was unoriginal, that he was copying other composers. And so that's where something can be quite fascinating of the way that he programmed things. So, for example, in St. Petersburg, in November 1907, he programmed his 5th Symphony with the most famous movement he wrote, the Adagietto, right, this slow movement that he had written as a love offering for his 19-year younger wife, Alma. So he performed this concert with the Prelude and Liebestod from the ultimate love opera, and invited the audience to make the connection between Tristan and the Adagietto. So let me play you the so-called gaze motive from Tristan, and then part of the Adagietto, and this is not him being unoriginal, this is him even pointing out what he was doing. Likewise, people would talk about the similarity between the opening of the last movement of his Seventh Symphony and Meistersinger. And here you see that was what he programmed together. So he's inviting, as he curates his own concert, to be making these connections. Since I feel guilty about doing so much Berlin, so much Vienna in this Berlin event, let me show two Berlin concerts. This is one, there are many concerts I'm showing you I'm very glad I didn't attend. I think they probably would have been quite miserable. They've been likened to, interest in medieval dentistry. It's maybe interesting but painful. But here's one from 1895 in Berlin, the Berlin Philharmonic, with Richard Strauss sharing the program with Mahler. And the great pianist Joseph Hoffmann, many thought he was the greatest pianist of the day. Rachmaninoff dedicated the third piano concerto to him. And so it opened with Strauss conducting Mendelssohn's Hebrides Overture, then Hoffmann played Saint-Saëns 4, and then Mahler conducted the first three movements of his Second Symphony, the Resurrection Symphony. Hoffmann played some Chopin and Liszt, and then it ended, as concerts often did, with another overture with Strauss conducting Weber's Oberon. And then a few months later in Berlin was the premiere with Mahler conducting of the complete Second Symphony. So 127 years later, I heard last 2 weeks ago, the Berlin Philharmonic played the Second Symphony, and a piece that they had premiered sort of twice, so to speak. Now to Beethoven, we move to, of course, the 19th century and Romanticism, and many things changed not only in the aesthetic world of the subjectivity of the artist and values of originality and so forth, but also concert life and things that begin to be more and more what we recognize, the rise of music journalism and of many musical magazines, the building of concert halls, the establishment of standing orchestras, the explosion of domestic music and piano construction, somewhat like with computers, that they became better and better very quickly and cheaper, so the centerpiece of the home, and so forth. So Beethoven gave many concerts, including in Berlin when he was 25 and made a trip here. So this is hardly a debut, but in some ways this was the first really important concert that he gave in Vienna. It was at the Burgtheater, so a court theater. You can see a grand musical academy. Academy was the name that was usually used for concerts, and seems really appropriate to be here talking about a lot of academies. Concerts were relatively rare for a whole variety of reasons. For one thing, there wasn't a permanent concert hall in Vienna until the 1830s, so concerts were often given in theaters during Advent and Lent when opera and theatrical productions weren't on, so the theater was available, and also the orchestra, since there was no Vienna Philharmonic, that was founded in 1842, you could hire the orchestra. They were available to play. So that was one sphere of concerts, public concerts that could happen, that were given either by composers, like Beethoven, who, arranged all of this. He gets the hall, he gets the orchestra, he advertises it, he curates it himself, he's programming it, he's presenting the entire event. Sometimes, more often, it was virtuosos that would do this. The other alternative were some societies, most importantly the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, that was founded in 1812, and that exists to this day, and that presented various concert series. And then sometimes charity concerts, and I'll show you one of them. There was the entire private sphere as well of domestic music making, in part because these events were not so numerous, of public concerts. You needed police permission to give them in repressive Vienna of the time. And so a lot of things happened domestically, and that's where Schubert thrived in what came to be called, in his own time, Schubertiads of domestic concerts. So here's how Beethoven put together this program presenting his himself to Vienna at the age of 29. And so it opened with a symphony by Mozart, again, by the late Kapellmeister Mozart. Speculation is it may have been number 39, the E flat. Then an aria from Haydn's Creation. Haydn was still alive, and Creation was a relatively recent piece of his. Then Beethoven played his first piano concerto, and then a septet, opus 20, that's scored for 4 strings and 3 wind instruments, most humbly and dedicated to the Empress, was performed. This was an enormously popular work of Beethoven's, and the musicians are listed, and Ignaz Schimpanzig, the violinist, is somebody that I will come back to. Then a duet from Haydn's Creation, then Beethoven improvised at the piano, and then it ended with the premiere of his first symphony. So Beethoven's curation of this important concert is to highlight exactly the 2 most significant composers to this day of Viennese classicism, of Haydn, who was his teacher, and Mozart, who was his model and idol. Perhaps the most famous concert that Beethoven gave, there's not a playbill for it, this blurry thing is from a review of it in the leading journal at the time, but this was an academy that he gave during Advent, 22nd of December, 1808, in the Theater an der Wien, which was built 7 years earlier. Beethoven had lived in the theater. Fidelio premiered there. And this is another concert that he assumed the responsibility for giving. And it was a long, nearly 4-hour event in a bitter cold evening that opened with the Pastoral Symphony, called number 5 on this occasion. Then A Perfido, which is a piece actually he had written for Josefina Ducek, that was the singer Mozart had written for. Then the Gloria from his Mass, the 4th Piano Concerto with Beethoven as soloist. The second half opened with the 5th Symphony, another movement of the Mass. Beethoven again improvised, and it ended with the Choral Fantasy, that's probably familiar to you, for piano, orchestra, soloists, and chorus, a sort of dry run for the 9th Symphony, during which we know from reviews and diary entries, things literally fell apart, and it had to start up again. So when I talk about medieval dentistry, these things were really under-rehearsed, if rehearsed at all. In some occasions they were not. The orchestras were made up of either theater orchestras or so-called dilettantes who were highly trained but not making their careers off of music. Okay, now to turn to Schubert. He as well, his music was being performed while he was a teenager and already getting a good deal of attention. But here is a concert that was a very important event for him in March 1821. Given by the wonderfully named Society of Ladies of the Nobility for the Promotion of the Good and the Useful. And this concert is quite typical in being such a potpourri of different things and just parts of pieces. It was absolutely expected that there would be Italian vocal music, particularly by Rossini, who was the leading, most performed composer not only in Vienna and in Germany and France and Italy at the time. So you see that it begins with an overture, but this also has tableaux vivants, and recitation of poetry, an aria by Mozart, one movement from a Spohr violin concerto, a part song by Schubert. Part songs were very frequently performed, but have almost entirely disappeared. They were usually written for two tenors and two basses, so vocal chamber music, Biedermeier barbershop, they're wonderful pieces that now are almost totally forgotten. A poem by a poet I've never heard about, but he died in Berlin and is buried here. And then piano variations by Voracek and another tableau. The second half of the concert begins with an overture, another aria, another poem, then Schubert's Der Erlkönig, sung by a leading singer of the time, Johann Michael Vogel, that had to be repeated and immediately encored. A review says that the music shows much imagination. Several successful passages were justly acclaimed by the public, which means they were clapping again during the music, right? And so successful that Vogel sang the song again. Then cello piece, Rossini, another vocal piece by Schubert, and ended with a tableau. So this gets me to the concert that I want to focus now for the rest of the talk, which is the Academy that Schubert gave on the first anniversary of Beethoven's death. And this is a concert I've recreated twice, and in the process looked more and more into the pieces and what was involved, and I think made some discoveries that therefore helped my scholarly activities. So the last 3 years of the Schubertiad, after we gave up playing every note Schubert wrote, my idea was to present 1 year of how Schubert was known in his own time. Things like the part songs or four-hand piano music or dances that have largely disappeared but that were published and performed, and how he was best known at the time. And so giving the context of really Schubert for his own time. Then the next year was the relationship between Beethoven, the composer he most revered, and Schubert. And then the final year, which was the bicentennial, 1997, was the 20 months that separate the deaths of Beethoven and Schubert. And that he produced just an absolutely staggering number of masterpieces, from Winterreise and Schwanengesang, the last three piano sonatas, the G major quartet, the C major string quintet, the E-flat Mass, the F minor Fantasy for piano duet. It's just an extraordinary, almost unique outpouring of so much music, of such quality in such a short time. So, as I said, this concert was on the first anniversary of Beethoven's death, and that got me interested of what connections might have been happening. It was not a memorial concert, of which there had been many immediately after Beethoven's death and around the anniversary. So the relationship and the death of Beethoven is something that interested me. Here's a report about Beethoven's death from the leading journal of the time. At 5:50, Beethoven passed into eternal rest, painless after an hour of sustained agony. At that moment, Schwanengesang was playing the incomparable Adagio from his piano trio in G. So I wonder whether Schubert was at that concert. He was usually at Schwanengesang's concerts. But the whole relationship and the personal relationship between Schubert and Beethoven is something that's been much explored. This is a fake image of an interesting encounter. You sometimes see it in books as if it really was contemporaneous of Beethoven walking and Schubert with a friend seeing each other. But the accounts of what a relationship would have been are oftentimes diametrically opposed. Schubert's older brother said that they frequently met, although he could not, for that reason, be called Beethoven's pupil, as is often done. One of Schubert's oldest friends, his classmate Joseph von Spaun, said Schubert often lamented, especially at the time of Beethoven's death, how much he regretted that the latter had been so inaccessible because of his deafness, and that he had never spoken to Beethoven. So again and again, these accounts don't help us too much. This, however, is one interesting thing early in Schubert's career, is Opus 10, Variations on a French song for piano four hands, dedicated to Beethoven from his worshiper and admirer, Franz Schubert. And even legally, he would have had to have Beethoven's permission to dedicate a piece to him. It could have been done through intermediaries. Around Beethoven's death, there's as well various anecdotes, most of which emerge decades after the events themselves. Anselm Hüttenbrenner said, "I know as an absolute fact that Professor Schindler, Schubert, and I visited Beethoven at his sickbed about a week before he died." Of a little bit more, what we do know is that Beethoven's funeral on the 29th of March was a major event in Vienna, attended by many thousands of people, and that Schubert participated in this. An account in Der Sammler magazine goes into quite detail about what happened and what was played. It lists the Kapellmeisters, who were the pallbearers, and then 36 torchbearers, which is really a list of luminaries of the time, and we see that Schubert was one of them. Then making the long march from the city to Währing Cemetery, where, because only priests were allowed to speak on consecrated grounds, the foremost Viennese actor, Heinrich Anschutz, stood at the gates of the cemetery and delivered a funeral oration by Franz Grillparzer, Austria's leading writer. And there are various versions of this funeral address, but as you see, he invokes the immortal fame of Handel and Bach, of Haydn and Mozart is no more. We stand weeping over the broken strings of an instrument now still. He was an artist, and who shall stand beside him? He traversed all. He comprehended everything. He who follows him cannot continue. He must begin anew, for his predecessor ended only where art ends. So I wonder what Schubert, age 30 and in precarious health, having had syphilis since 1822, is thinking when he hears his friend Grillparzer's speech about his idol Beethoven, and that there's only 20 months left in Schubert's life and what he does during that time. Schubert knew that he did not have much longer to live, and his friend Spaun says Beethoven's death shocked him very deeply. Did he perhaps have a premonition of how soon he would follow him and rest at his side? So this is during the time in which he wrote this astonishing output of 20 months. And also prepared to give this concert. So in perhaps the most important letter that we have of Schubert's, he talks about what his plans are. And he says that he hasn't written many new songs, but he's tried his hand at several instrumental works. I wrote 2 string quartets and an octet, and I plan to write another quartet. I intend to pave the way toward a grand symphony in that manner. And then, as if by process of free association, he says, the latest in Vienna is that Beethoven is to give a concert at which he is to produce his new symphony, 3 movements from the new Mass and a new overture. God willing, I too am thinking of giving a similar concert next year. So this was the famous Academy of May 1824 that had the consecration of the House Overture, 3 movements from the Missa Solemnis, and the premiere of the Ninth Symphony. And this is a work that as Schubert's paving the way towards a grand symphony that he writes the next year, he makes in the last movement an allusion to Beethoven. So the famous Ode to Joy theme, and then the last movement. So this concert that he gives, finally, in 1824, he wants to give the concert next year. It doesn't happen in 25, 26, 27, but in 28, finally it takes place. This is the program. It begins with the first movement of a new string quartet of Schubert's, then 4 songs sung by Vogel, the great opera singer, then Ständchen, a serenade with a poem by Grillparzer, sung by a soprano and some women students from the conservatory. Then the premiere of the E-flat piano trio, Auf dem Strom, which is a work for horn and piano. Then another song that Vogel sang, and then it ended with a double male chorus. So it's again a miscellany of mainly new works. Since I produced this twice, I know how expensive this is to do. You do not hire a string quartet to play by the note. We're paying them to play 12 minutes of music. And then we need different singers, and we need a women's chorus and a men's chorus, and a piano trio, and some good singers. So but this was a concert that was a considerable success. And this is the way Schubert curated himself. So that made me begin to look at exactly what was there, and particularly the E-flat piano trio. The second movement of which I think is most explicitly the one that honors Beethoven. And so here is the beginning of this. Now we know that Schubert made use of a Swedish folk song in this piece. As you know, Schubert often made use of his own lieder within instrumental pieces, like the Trout Quintet. And thanks to Reinhold for trout tonight for dinner. Schubert would have loved that. In this case, it was not his own song, but a Swedish folk song. And the most important thing about this is the octave leap in the voice echoed by the piano, that is the words farewell, farewell. So let me just play the opening of the song. So there are actually 3 melodic fragments that Schubert takes from this song and quite clearly makes use of in the movement. As I say, the concert was a success. It made Schubert a fair amount of money. He also reached out to Beethoven's publishers outside of Vienna to get the work published, and The review in the leading journal said if all these works by Beethoven on the 23rd of March, a concert given by the same musicians 3 days earlier, were performed to perfection, afforded an indescribable oral treat, the same must be said with hardly less emphasis in praise of the soirée musicale that the excellent Schubert held in the very same place on the 26th. So Schubert is getting the comparison from the leading journal to Beethoven, exactly. And that concert 3 days earlier, as I said, had some of the same musicians and is noteworthy because it was the premiere of Beethoven's last work, the String Quartet number 16 in F, opus 135, with the famous Muss es sein, es muss sein motive. Now, even if I had 2 hours to go into the analysis of this and really try to make the large argument about it, it's very, very, could be very, very extended. But the basic point that I would make is that this second movement in particular looks to the funeral march of the Eroica Symphony of Beethoven. It begins by doing so in an elusive way. It's the same sort of mood, it's the same meter, the same key, the same dotted rhythm, the same contour, basic contour of the melody. And people have heard this and comment about it in criticism for nearly 200 years. But it becomes explicit at the end of the movement when Schubert takes a violin and flute line and puts it in the piano accompaniment nearly note for note. And then a final farewell, farewell. Now, Schubert is often portrayed as sort of clueless in that he wouldn't do things like this. Schumann and Berg and others would do these sorts of things. But this is a quotation, and it shows, I think, quite clearly that the Eroica was on his mind. We fortunately have for this piece, because he wrote it near the end and didn't have time for the sketches to get lost, sketches for the movement. And here's something that he cut out because I think it was too obvious to make the connection to Beethoven. Right, so no Beethoven fifth. He gets rid of that, but it was there. That, you know, it shows Beethoven on the brain. And then the fantastic finale of this, the fourth movement, brings back 3 times the theme from the second movement, which itself is a Beethoven cyclical type of device that was rather uncommon at the time, but that Beethoven had done in his Fifth Symphony and the Ninth Symphony and other works. So as I say, there are many connections to Beethoven. To wrap up the Beethoven-Schubert story a bit, 8 months later, Schubert died in the apartment of his older brother Ferdinand. And this is a draft of a letter Ferdinand sent to their father, Franz Schubert Sr., saying that many people would like for Schubert to be buried next to Beethoven, and that he thinks that Schubert himself wanted this in his final delirium. He said, "This is not where Beethoven lies." Is this not an indication that he wished to be buried next to Beethoven? The space next door was not free, so to speak, but he got fairly close. So you see the Schubert and Beethoven graves there. And here it is today with a rather unusual bronze bust that was made, and the famous epitaph written by Franz Grillparzer, "The art of music here entombs a rich possession, but even far fairer hopes." and Schubert's birth dates, and 31 years old. So dead at 31. And this is something of health and death and politics that are on all of our minds today, and for past few years now with the pandemic and threats to democracy and now the war in Ukraine. And I think about the four composers I've focused on tonight, all of whom spent the most important part of their career in Vienna, and would have passed by on an almost daily basis the Vienna Plague column on the Graben in the center of Vienna, which was erected in 1694 to honor the Great Plague of Vienna in 1679, and also triumphant over the Ottomans in 1863. All of these composers struggled with health and with death. Many deaths of siblings for Schubert and Mahler in particular. They died relatively early, Schubert at 31, Mozart 35, Mahler 50, Beethoven 56. It's perhaps easiest for us to make the connections between Beethoven's deafness and what he does in some of his pieces, or Schubert's syphilis, but it's there in Mozart and Mahler as well. And so I think this is part of, as well, trying to make the connections between life and what is happening in one's own life and in the world around one, with politics really being central as well to these figures' lives. Grillparzer wrote in one of the conversation books to Beethoven. That's why Beethoven, you could communicate with him in the last decade when he was totally deaf. Musicians are lucky. They don't have to bother about the censors. But if only the censors knew what the musicians are thinking as they compose. So all of these composers were, their music was deeply involved with the political situation at the time. Mozart in a more optimistic way, because it's when Joseph II became emperor, liberalized many things in Vienna, improved the healthcare system, the education system, more religious tolerance, loosened censorship, and so forth. And there was this moment that did not last long of considerable liberalization. And Mozart was provocative of this. 2 years before the French Revolution, we get in the Act 1 finale of Don Giovanni, the Viva la Libertà, shouted out, full chorus, trumpets blaring. And of course, Beethoven as well, throughout his career, beginning with his first major piece at age 19, a cantata on the death of Joseph II to honor him. And then we think of Fidelio and Egmont, and of course, the Ninth Symphony. And Schiller's words there, the Ode to Joy, the An die Freude, that Leonard Bernstein famously in Christmas Day concert here in Berlin in 1989 changed to Freiheit, which is the way many would have heard it in Beethoven's time anyway. Bernstein was well aware of this. And so it really, if it was dangerous at the time to speak of Freiheit, you could speak of Freude. And so this is... Freiheit! Freiheit! Freiheit, schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium, wir betreten... So much of the music that we love and value and cherish has deep political connections and connections with so many aspects of life. But oftentimes, as I said earlier, we tend to isolate music, in particular in the ways that we don't do as much with the other arts, and listen to it more in a vacuum. And I find that engaging my students and public audiences, that it is so effective to make the opportunity to have these connections and to rescue music from its splendid isolation, to smarten up concert life rather than to dumb it down. And that's something that I see that's happening here in Berlin, and it is very exciting to witness and to study. It makes me worry less about the so-called death of classical music. Classical music always seems to be dying. I don't know whether it's a case of murder, suicide, or life support, but it's something that as a historian, I see the way things change, and that needs to be responded to, and actually it offers opportunities to curate better, to care more. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm after a long lecture about the long 19th century. I'm glad there's about a half an hour that we have for conversation, discussion, questions, as well the opportunity for those that are joining us virtually to do so. So is there somebody? Yes. All right.
I have a question about time. One of those. Thank you. I have a question about time. One of those very long programs with 16 items on it, how much time are we talking about, and what sorts of things might the audience have been doing to keep itself going during what was apparently pretty long time?
Great. Well, so the Mozart Leipzig concert was 3 hours. That one with Schubert, the Academy of the Women of the Good and the Useful, as well. And some of the things are being repeated, and then the premiere of the Fifth and Sixth Symphony and all these things. So concerts were long, and they were miscellaneous things, and they tended to be well attended, and I really wonder oftentimes, this is something that is not talked about in contemporaneous sources too much of yes, literally how the mechanics of it all worked. We're aware from, this is popularized in movies and so forth, of people talking and eating during concerts and not the rapt attention and so forth. And that seems to be true. And they're clapping during the Mozart symphony. We know the second movement of Beethoven's Ninth was, people loved the timpani interjections because the reviews talk about how people were clapping during it. So it is a fascinating question as well of that begins to change over the 19th century as composers write longer and longer symphonies and operas that are expected to be performed with a sort of religious reverence, sitting through the entire work interrupted, and eventually, that you don't even applaud at all during the movements, let alone between movements and so forth, and extending, to Wagner of the fantastic length of his operas. Mark Twain came to the premiere of The Ring and was just astounded of how long Germans could sit, silently. So. Yes. Chris, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I think you are in a really almost unique position as a scholar/curator, as a scholar who understands what concerts have been over a long sweep of time, how they've changed, and a curator who has yearly a chance to maybe put some of your historical awareness into action. The notion that you don't need to do a whole symphony, that would be blasphemy now. But why not break up a symphony the way you were suggesting Mozart did, or Beethoven certainly did at times? Why not bring in a leader singer in the middle of the first half of the concert or something? Are there opportunities for you?
Yes, we sometimes do that, of recreating concerts. A little bit more of the focus at the Bard Festival is to try to expand the repertory. And that can mean playing a Dvorak symphony that's not 5, 6, 7, or 8, really 7, 8, or 9, but also, contemporaries and composers that have disappeared. We often let the composers curate our concerts for us to the extent of what did Schumann most revere as a critic, right? So if he thinks that Niels Gade and William Sterndale Bennett is so great as composers, we give him great praise for sort of discovering Chopin and Brahms, but he's about as enthusiastic for Gade and Sterndale Bennett. So there must be something there, and looking at the pieces or who did Mahler pair on his concerts? What was he conducting? Who did he respect? And that's the idea that, as I say, from the museum world, we're much more used to, that we love seeing all these paintings in dialogue with each other, and don't expect every single one of them to be, or far from it. It's sort of a show around Vermeer, and you're going to be lucky to get 2 Vermeers there, right? But you're going to see what was influencing him and who he influenced, and make these connections. So the most vital thing I think we try to do now with the curating of a festival around a particular figure in his or her world each year is really to expand the repertory and how essential that is. But sometimes, yes, we can do it of just bringing people up short of what the way that this would have been heard in the original times. Yes, Cameron. Yeah, I think there's a microphone.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm really curious about the intersection between the audiences and the politics. So throughout the course of the long 19th century, of course, starting with these sort of rowdy beginnings and the way that ends up becoming, longer operas and longer symphonies. But are the people who are coming to the concerts, does that change over the period? And does that change the politics of the music itself and the way that the politics are kind of understood by the audiences themselves?
Yes, so this gets into larger questions. I say Vienna is what I can speak to best, of who was giving the concerts, and that they weren't terribly numerous, and who was attending them, and the just facts of who would have access to attending public concerts at the time, who was educated, who had the financial resources, was remarkably limited at the beginning in Beethoven's time, and changes very, very dramatically over the course of the century. Democratization of the public space and of concerts in general. The ticket prices weren't so high, but if you're a servant, and Beethoven and Schubert, these people had their servants and so forth, yet Schubert's quite poor, it wouldn't have occurred to many of them to go to concerts. So that opening up and expansion of the audience, and expansion as I sort of alluded to in every way, it is a burst of music journals. Its instruments become cheaper. An instrument that was very important in Schubert's time, we think of him writing these great songs for voice and piano. Most of them were released with guitar accompaniment, because guitars were much less expensive. People played them at home, and that offered, yet another. And that's great to do at, when I curate a concert at the Y, we did Schubert Lieder in the original Diabelli variations, of Diabelli issues of that appeared simultaneously. So Erlkönig with the guitar is quite a hoot, right? It's unexpected. And there's even a chance, and Schubert played the guitar and his guitar exists, that he actually even wrote the guitar version. That wasn't a transcription, hired by Diabelli to make it. So it gets you thinking about a lot of things. And then his friend Hüttenbrenner, who accompanied Vogel at this concert when Erlkönig was repeated, he wrote a set of Erlkönig waltzes that Diabelli published as well. And, but publishers were publishing endless waltzes and gallops, and that was, a big market for these sorts of things. But you just wouldn't think that that would be the lead that would be turned into a triple meter waltz. Tess.
How much knowledge did they assume on the part of their audiences? So if they're breaking up symphonies by movements, interspersing them with lieder or so forth, did they assume that their audience could follow what the symphony was as a whole? Was there an idea of a musical piece as a whole?
Yeah, well, no, this raises yet another. So if the audiences were relatively elite and well-educated, the fact is that most of them played as well. They played the piano at home. They actually, therefore, had, yes, a musical awareness, perhaps more sensitivity to key schemes and modulations and things that, as much as many audiences today love it, they don't quite know what's happening at that moment that's, transcendently moving. And so even more likely that some of the audience there could quite specifically talk musically about what was happening, although they weren't professional musicians. I mean, they're doctors and lawyers, but they all play the piano. Schubert's circle of friends, for the most part, were not professional musicians, and yet it becomes clear in the correspondence that all of them play the piano. And they're singing and they're doing the part songs at the Schubertiads, but they are mainly civil servants and lawyers, and two very distinguished artists, Leopold Kupelwieser, whose paintings you can see in Berlin museums, and Moritz van Schwind, that you'll see more of him in Munich. So, but here are really prominent artists, and then some writers. Grillparzer wasn't a really close friend, but very prominent figure. And as I say, they all could sit down at the piano and play it, most of them. And so that informs a different kind of listening, which makes it's sort of interesting. Yeah, so why do you break up the concerts in this way, except that these were concert habits, and they change over time, and we see them changing in our day and so forth. But really it's, more or less the turn of the century, around 1900, Mahler played a role, and Toscanini and others, that said, really no clapping during concerts. Let's, be silent, turn down the house lights, make this into a much more serious event. So it's a gradual process. Is there a question from the
Only because it follows directly on the heels of Tessa's question. So the first thing was just a thought that crossed my mind, which is if we have concerts with original instruments, we should have concerts with original audience as well, which would be a very interesting experiment. But I just wanted to drill down a little more on the development. So you talk about how concert going becomes more democratized over the 19th century. Is it only at the end that we get this sort of sacralization of art and the whole hush and you got to be quiet and behave and kids don't clap and that sort of thing? Or is that more linear throughout the 19th century?
I would say it's very gradual, but also it no doubt is maybe more different in Paris than it is in Leipzig and Vienna. But it goes in line with many of our ideas and ideals about the romantic artist, and of the artist, him or herself, is becoming sort of a holy figure that has this knowledge. They're not servants. Haydn was treated very well by the Esterházy family, but he worked for the richest family, barring the emperor, in the Austria sphere, and the Esterházys had their own orchestra and opera company and everything like that, and he had to write 125 baritone trios for Prince Esterházy and so forth, and follow orders and to that extent. Except he fortunately lived such a long life, and unfortunately Prince Esterházy died, and the family didn't want to continue the tradition, and so he sort of discovered, and Haydn goes in the public sphere with the famous London concerts and 2 extended trips to London and writing his last 12 symphonies for London, that he now doesn't need to please the one man, the employer, who, by the way, not only played the baritone, which is sort of like a cello-like instrument, but, really was very sophisticated musically, would get the in-jokes that Haydn was putting in his music. Now, Haydn is having to write for the public, quite literally, the broad, paying public in Hanover Square in London, and please them. Original audiences and original instruments and so forth become fascinating as well to think about.
So here's a question from an online listener. Thank you for a fascinating talk. If you fast forward to today, how do you assess the role of music in political and social events that shape our lives? We know of operas that have taken up prominent current topics, John Williams, etc. I'd be interested in your views on how politics and social change influence composers today.
Well, yes, we probably think a little bit more immediately within the pop world and the connections between not only pop stars, but big concerts and big events that can mobilize vast audiences and raise money and so forth. But exactly this does continue. It can be John Adams' operas of Nixon in China and so forth that have overtly political themes to them. And we have composer here and other composers that it is the lived experience, and I guess what I was trying to make the case for earlier is maybe we're more likely to make the connection right now with popular music or with an opera like Nixon in China. But if one looks at what Verdi was doing and his relationship with censorship, and if one, really throughout the context of for almost every composer, it's just so obvious. But I think it's unfortunately mystified of us not thinking about it enough. And that's where the curation idea and these ancillary activities, it can be a pre-concert talk, well-written program notes that are informed and so forth. I mean, when I growing up in New York and went to Carnegie Hall, there would almost never be a pre-concert talk, and the program notes were really written by people that were just repeating the cliches that were on the liner notes that they were semi-plagiarizing and so forth. And this has been an enormous change in recent decades, and that's what I see happening here in very exciting ways as well. So it's I maybe am sort of exaggerating the problem of it, but just encouraging more and more that it's the right direction to be thinking about it and not just have the concert in isolation, but also responding, as I did earlier, to expanding the repertory and making the connections as well by having a piece that's unfamiliar juxtaposed with the familiar Beethoven, and how illuminating that can be. Yes.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for this talk. I do think that German audience among all the audience really can sit even today. I think like the Neuschwanstein Festival today that Richard Strauss started and just celebrated its 100th anniversary last year. Every piece is a world premiere from 10 a.m. to midnight, and the audience still can sit. And so then every time I am in Germany, I'm very envious this classical music and knowing it's actually part of the blood. And this is something so cool in this lineage, So I wonder, as a fellow musician, that what's your take on this when we're talking about transcultural studies, what classical music would really mean to Americans? Like, we're not just talking about, I think I'm not talking about the death of classical music. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about this identity and this cultural memory and what does it mean? Because if you're not looking at the architecture of Leipzig and Vienna, and a lot of things don't really make sense other than Beethoven's symphony on program notes. So what does it really mean? And I think this would mean in today's music as well, because today's music is reflect of what our time is. So I just want to hear about your take on your experience and when your education, with your audience in America, like what's that relation is to our American audience of this approximity to the so-called Western classical music.
Right, yeah. I would say that the Bard Festival we're very lucky of being near New York City, which has an enormous population, and finding people that are very hungry for this sort of curated experience is actually rather similar. We start at 10 in the morning and end after 10 in the evening, and have given 3 concerts and probably some lectures and panel and something like that. And so it's an immersive experience over the course of a summer. And but it's something that I talked about with some of you in the room, that a trust is formed, that people come every year. They came because they wanted to hear Beethoven in his world, and the next year is Berg in his world or Janáček in his world, and they will give us the benefit of the doubt because the experience was so satisfying of giving this contextualization and hearing unfamiliar pieces. But you have to have trust that you're choosing the interesting works that still relate, as when you reference contemporary music that is our world today, that has another level of the engagement. But as you say, when you're resuscitating music that's 2 centuries old from another culture, how will audiences respond to that? But again, maybe the museum context is helpful in that there are a lot of people that are interested in this and that want to explore it, and the challenge is finding ways to give them information that is helpful and accurate and goes beyond cliches and connects all these different spheres. It connects the political, the literary, the world of visual arts, and that therefore makes all of it richer. You'll understand various things in literature or Picasso perhaps better if you're understanding what Stravinsky's trying to do at the same time, and that they collaborated together and they're drawn together, and in what ways and why, and learn from each other. So it's America, in this regard, as an enormous country with a musical traditions that in the sphere that I'm talking about is something that it was largely imported from Europe over time, or American composers that went to Europe to study, usually to Leipzig and then later to Paris, as well becomes a somewhat different issue than a continuing European tradition. Yes?
Thank you so much, Christopher, for this lovely lecture. Speaking of Bard Music Festival, which I had the pleasure to attend a few summers, actually, while I was studying there, it's now more than ever striking, especially at the first sort of slide that you presented, and how like it was all just pictures of dead white men as composers. Mm-hmm. And we all know that kind of this is the legacy that we are left with in terms of classical music and in general Western culture, so to speak. But maybe can you speak a little bit at how you grapple with this as co-artistic director, and how do you maybe find answers to questions of representation, diversity, but also not tokenizing? Right.
Yeah. No, it's a big challenge that we've thought about for years, not just more recent urgency to it. So last summer we did our first Dead Woman, Nadia Boulanger and her world. I will say that one of the governing ideas with the festival is that you have to be dead. And this is something that perhaps Leon Botstein just has found, that there are too many living composers that you would anger by when you choose, including on our faculty, when you make the decision of who's going to be the first living composer. And when I say that to some of these composers who ask, like my colleague Joan Tower, they suddenly become less interested immediately in getting the honor, and they say they're happy to wait a while. So in that regard, although we have a real commitment at the conservatory and at the college and Leon and for the American Symphony Orchestra and so forth to living composers, that's one thing that's made it a little bit easier, that we're a historical festival that wants to rediscover the past in that regard. And throughout the years, particularly with women, that's been something that, since it is the world of these composers, is rather easy to figure out how to insert. And not just the obvious case of, when we do Schumann or Brahms, that there can be a lot of Clara Schumann. We staged Ethel Smythe's The Wreckers, a major opera, a few years ago, and last summer did another opera of hers, so that's less difficult to do. And now we're thinking into the future of how to broaden that representation that has tended to shift from the other thing we exclude. I say, you have to be dead, but you can't have been dead for too long. So we actually don't get into the whole problems around historical performance practices. We haven't done Bach or Handel. We don't go back so far. And we sort of do rotate around Russia, Europe, America. The Americas, we did Carlos Chavez and his world, the leading Mexican composer, about 5 years ago. And that was a fascinating experience. I mean, to explore the world of our neighbor, that our audiences much more knew the literature, Mexican literature, and they knew the muralists, but Chavez and Reveltas and Ponce and the leading composers were unfamiliar to most of the audience. And it was a very exciting experience. So, we're challenged now to think more of how this expands in the future, but exactly the word you used of tokenism and a certain, perhaps, cynicism, and also having to plan it years in advance, which we have to do because we have a book that comes around it, makes it really a complex jigsaw puzzle to put together, but we're very glad to be even more challenged of thinking about how this directions have to go. So I think there could be...
One more question?
Yes, Lawrence. You missed the Farella, but I'm glad you're here.
I was just struck in one of the concert programs, the Beethoven Improvisation. And I was wondering how much improvisation actually played in these concerts at the time, whether that was anomalous or routine. And maybe this also connects with Daniel's question about sacralization. At what point did improvisation maybe fall out of the repertoire of concerts?
Yeah, so it was totally routine and expected, and sometimes, just like ask for the melody from the audience and do, like name your favorite opera tune and I'll improvise a fantasy on it. And there's a good bit of evidence that really this truly was improvisation. It was not, sort of the improvisation worked out at home before, but it was totally a skill and something that these musicians were raised with. And so for Mozart or Beethoven, was expected they would do it on the concert. They did it extraordinarily well, and it continued with Liszt, who I've studied a lot of his programs, and the reviews are fascinating about it because it is sort of like name your favorite tune, and there would be two of them, juxtaposing a Handel aria with a Schubert lead, and he would mix the themes together and end with a fugue on the two themes together, and it's just amazing. But it's clear he did it, and it would be 45 minutes long, right? And that's a skill, as we all know, that's been lost. And it had practical implications of Mozart piano concertos that the cadenzas would be improvised. So if he's writing the concerto for himself, we oftentimes don't have the cadenza. If he's writing it for his sister or his student Barbara Ployer, then we have a cadenza because he wrote it down for them. And in other cases, we have Beethoven cadenzas for Mozart concertos, up to Philip Glass writing cadenzas for it. So it was quite real that it was expected that you could and would do this, and the audience clearly liked it, and it's something that we've lost to an extent that's, it must have been thrilling, in other words, right? Yeah. So thank you so much for coming.